The Middle Ages, Part 2. 1. Definition. The Middle Ages, also called the medieval period, refers to that period in European history from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Reformation. It's from the 5th to the 15th century. The first half of this period is the so-called Dark Ages, when Europe was in turmoil as local rulers fought among themselves to gain control. 2. Feudalism. From the second half of the Middle Ages, Europe was run by a system of government known as feudalism. Under feudalism, the land in a country was owned by the king, who passed on most of it to his so-called vassals, who were the barons and bishops in the country. This land was called a fief, and in return for it, the vassals agreed to be loyal to the king and to provide soldiers for the king's army when needed. The vassals then passed on most of the land to knights. The land received by these lords was called a manor and included the village and the surrounding land. 3. Farming. Peasants, called serfs, rented land from the local lord, the knights referred to just now. They grew crops and grazed cattle on this land. They needed the permission of the lord if they wished to move to another village or to marry. Serfs were also required to work on the land kept by the lord or knight at different times during the year. A relatively small number of peasants were freemen who also rented land from the lord but were free to move and to marry without permission. 4. The three-field system or open field system of farming. The land held by a lord was known as a manor and was made up of a village, the land surrounding it, a stone manor house, or a stone castle if the lord was very powerful, a church, probably stone, and the wattle and daub houses of the peasants. Farming was carried out in 3 large open fields. One field would be used to grow wheat for bread, another would grow barley or oats for beer or food or feed, and the third field would grow nothing for a year to allow the soil to recover. The use of the fields was rotated between these 3 alternatives so that each year one of the fields would be fallow. Cattle grazed on the village common. Flax might be grown to make linen, and sheep provided the wool. Both linen and wool were used in clothing. Medieval villages were surrounded by forests where the wild boar and deer that were hunted by the lords grazed. 5. The life of the peasant. Although the manor house was built of stone, only kings and princes and very powerful lords lived in castles. The houses of the peasants were not much better than the wattle and daub houses of the earlier historical periods. The frame was made from strong branches stuck into the ground at intervals, and smaller branches were then woven between these to make the walls. Mud was then daubed over this to keep out drafts. The roofs were made of straw, thatched. One room was used for sleeping and the other for eating. In winter, the peasants brought their animals into the house for warmth and to keep them safe. The clothes of the peasants were made from linen or wool. Flax was grown and the women wove this into linen cloth. The wool came from the sheep and was spun. Although silk came to Europe from the east during the Crusades, it was too expensive for the peasants and was worn only by the wealthy. The diet of the peasants was mainly dark bread, pottage, which was porridge and vegetable soup, and cheese. Meat was rarely eaten by the peasants, and ale or cider was safer to drink than the water from the local river because that could be contaminated. The pastimes of the peasants included many games that survived to today, such as noughts and crosses, draughts, chess, wrestling, and Hoodman Blind. 6. Medieval towns. Medieval towns usually developed around the large castles and river crossings. This was due to the protection that could be had from the lord of the castle and from the amount of trade that could be done with the people crossing the river. Towns weren't very populated, and few of them would have had over 1,000 inhabitants. Medieval towns were given permission by the king to govern themselves. This permission was called a charter, and when we hear of a town or city celebrating its, for example, 500th anniversary, it refers to how long ago they received that charter. Towns were usually walled for protection, with gates that could be entered during the day and that were closed and guarded at night. The main street was usually paved and was slightly above the level of the other streets to ensure that water and rubbish would run off. Because of this, it was called the High Street. The merchant and tradesmen had well-built timber houses on the High Street. Poorer people had their wattle and daub houses in the other streets and sometimes outside the town walls. The poorer a family was, the farther they lived from the centre. As many houses were built of timber, a bell was rung at night to remind the townspeople to put out the fire. This was known as the curfew, from Old French couvre-feu, or cover the fire. Houses had back gardens, where vegetables were grown and where pigs and hens were kept for pork and eggs. Other food could be bought at the weekly markets that was held in the market square in the town centre. According to themselves, the most important people in a medieval town were the merchants and the master craftsmen, who formed guilds that controlled their business and the town. They set prices for their services and decided how a person could become a tradesman. Only guild members could be citizens of the town and vote to elect the town council, who ran the town and raised the tax needed. Medieval trades included shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, bakers, butchers, weavers who made cloth, tailors who made clothes, coopers who made barrels, and millers who made flour, masons who built with stone, tanners who made leather, and chandlers who made candles. To become a master craftsman, a boy became an apprentice at the age of 12. He would live in the workshop at the back of the shop and would work for 7 years without pay, learning the craft. When the 7 years were up, the apprentice became a journeyman and either continued to work for his master for pay or would travel to other towns looking for a new master who would pay more or provide better conditions. If the journeyman could afford to make a high payment to the guild and produce a masterpiece to a sufficient standard, he became a master craftsman. Few could manage to find enough money and stayed journeymen. Towns were generally dirty, with the residents simply throwing out their waste into the gutters in the streets. They did the same with their toilet waste. It wasn't the custom to wash regularly, and everyone carried fleas. As a result of such conditions, diseases were common and spread easily among the tightly packed community of a medieval town. Sometimes diseases had devastating effects. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, which began in 1347 and lasted for 5 years, killed between 30 and 50% of the population of Western Europe and had a far worse effect on the towns than on the country.